Chapter 1. Dust and Destiny. The stagecoach rattled along the barren trail, leaving billowing clouds of dust in its wake as it cut through the vast emptiness of the West Texas frontier. Inside, Benjamin Mercer wiped the perspiration from his brow with a handkerchief that had long since lost its pristine white color to the relentless dust of the journey. The year was 1881, and Mercer, a journalist from Boston with aspirations that outweighed his experience, had been sent west by his newspaper to document the true frontier spirit for their eastern readers. Approaching Crow's Creek, folks, the driver called out, his voice barely audible over the creak of wooden wheels and the steady rhythm of hooves striking hard-packed earth. Last stop before Clarendon. Benjamin peered through the grime-coated window at the approaching settlement, little more than a scattered collection of wooden structures rising from the Texas plains like crooked teeth. The town wasn't on any map he'd studied before departing Boston, but the driver had mentioned it was a common rest stop for weary travelers. "How long will we be stopping?" asked the elderly woman seated across from Benjamin, her fingers nervously working the fabric of her dress. "Just the night, ma'am," replied the driver. "These horses need rest, and there's a storm brewing from the west. We'll continue at first light." As the stagecoach pulled into what passed for the town's main street, Benjamin observed the few structures comprising Crow's Creek: a general store, a small church with a weathered cross, a saloon where 3 men lounged on the porch nursing amber bottles, and at the edge of town a 2-story building with a freshly painted sign reading Wilcox Inn and Dining. The stagecoach lurched to a stop before the inn. Benjamin gathered his notebook and satchel, stepping down into ankle-deep dust that immediately coated his city boots. The air smelled of livestock, dry earth, and something else, something pungent that hung in the background, which he attributed to the nearby cattle yards. "Welcome to Wilcox Inn," came a booming voice from the porch. A barrel-chested man with an immaculately trimmed beard and penetrating blue eyes stepped forward, extending a hand thick with calluses. "Abraham Wilcox, proprietor. You folks look in need of a hot meal and proper beds." "Indeed we do," Benjamin replied, shaking the offered hand. "Benjamin Mercer, Boston Herald." Wilcox's eyes narrowed momentarily. "A newspaper man? What brings you to our humble corner of nowhere?" "Documenting the frontier for our readers back east." A peculiar smile crept across Wilcox's face. "Well then, you're in luck, Mr. Mercer. We have plenty of stories here in Crow's Creek. More than your eastern readers might believe." Benjamin followed Wilcox into the inn, noting how the other passengers seemed to give the innkeeper a wide berth despite his apparent congeniality. Inside, the establishment was surprisingly clean and well appointed for such a remote location. A large dining room occupied most of the first floor, with a staircase leading to what Benjamin presumed were the guest rooms. "You'll have the best room, mister," Mercer Wilcox announced, leading him up the stairs. "A man of letters deserves proper accommodations. Dinner will be at 6, my special venison stew. Never had a guest who didn't praise it." As Wilcox departed, Benjamin unpacked his meager belongings. From his window he could see the rear of the property, where a small smokehouse stood beside a large barn. A teenage boy was dragging what appeared to be a heavy sack from the barn to the smokehouse, his thin frame struggling under the weight. Something about the scene struck Benjamin as odd, though he couldn't place why. Perhaps it was the way Wilcox suddenly appeared, startling the boy and causing him to drop the sack. Or maybe it was the innkeeper's unusually aggressive gestures as he berated the lad, occasionally glancing toward the inn as if concerned about being observed. Benjamin turned away from the window, attributing his unease to the fatigue of travel. He made a few notes in his journal about the town and its curious innkeeper before heading downstairs for dinner, unaware that he was about to become entangled in a horror that would eventually make headlines across the nation. Chapter 2. Suspicious flavors. The dining room of Wilcox Inn had transformed since Benjamin's arrival. Oil lamps cast a warm glow across tables draped with surprisingly fine linens. A dozen or so travelers gathered, the stagecoach passengers, a cattle buyer passing through, and 3 dusty men Benjamin assumed were local ranchers. The delicious aroma of simmering meat and herbs filled the air, making his stomach growl in anticipation. "Special tonight is my famous frontier stew," Wilcox announced, emerging from the kitchen with a large pot. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing powerful forearms corded with muscle. "Secret family recipe from back east, with local ingredients that give it that special ... something." The innkeeper moved from table to table, ladling generous portions into ceramic bowls. When he reached Benjamin, he paused, studying the journalist's face. "Extra portion for our writer friend," Wilcox said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Need to keep your strength up to tell all those stories." Benjamin thanked him and lifted a spoonful to his mouth. The stew was indeed remarkable, rich and complex, with a depth of flavor he hadn't experienced since leaving Boston. The meat was tender, falling apart with barely any resistance, seasoned with herbs he couldn't quite identify. "This is extraordinary," Benjamin commented. "What type of venison is this?" A flicker of something, amusement, concern, crossed Wilcox's face. "Just Texas deer, Mr. Mercer. Though they taste different out here. Must be what they feed on." As the meal progressed, Benjamin observed Wilcox moving between tables, engaging guests in conversation, particularly those traveling alone. The innkeeper seemed especially interested in their destinations and whether anyone was expecting them. "Passing through to California," the cattle buyer was saying. "Family waiting in Sacramento." Wilcox's smile dimmed slightly at this information. At a nearby table, the elderly woman from the stagecoach was picking at her food with obvious distaste. "Something isn't right with this meat," she murmured to her companion. Benjamin watched as Wilcox approached her table, his manner solicitous but with an underlying tension. "Is the meal not to your liking, ma'am? It tastes unusual," she replied carefully. "Almost gamey, but not like any venison I've had before." "Well, frontier cooking isn't for everyone's palate," Wilcox responded, a hint of coldness creeping into his voice. "Perhaps some bread and butter would suit you better." After dinner, Benjamin stepped outside for fresh air. The night had grown cool, with a quarter moon providing just enough light to navigate the town's single street. He nodded to a passing stranger who tipped his hat in response. "First time at Wilcox's?" the man asked, stopping beside Benjamin. "Yes, just arrived today." The stranger, lean, weathered, with a sheriff's badge pinned to his vest, studied Benjamin carefully. "Named Sheriff Callahan. Don't see many Easterners here. I'm with the Boston Herald." Writing about frontier life, the sheriff's expression darkened. "Interesting you'd stop in Crow's Creek. Hardly representative." "The stagecoach decision, not mine," Benjamin explained. "Is there something wrong with this town?" Callahan glanced toward the inn. "Not wrong, exactly. Just ... peculiar happenings. Travelers who stop here sometimes don't reach their next destination. 8 disappearances in 2 years. Benjamin felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "And no explanation?" "Nothing concrete, just theories." The sheriff lowered his voice. "I'd be careful what you eat here, Mr. Journalist, and I'd make damn sure. I was on that stagecoach when it leaves tomorrow." Before Benjamin could press for details, the inn door opened, spilling lamplight onto the porch. Wilcox stood framed in the doorway, his imposing figure casting a long shadow across the dirt. "Everything all right out here, Sheriff?" His tone was friendly, but Benjamin detected an undercurrent of tension. "Just welcoming our visitor," Callahan replied evenly. "Making sure he gets the full picture of our little community." Wilcox's smile tightened. "Well, don't keep him too long. Man needs his rest before the journey tomorrow." As the sheriff walked away, Benjamin noticed something else behind the inn movement near the smokehouse. In the dim moonlight, he could make out Wilcox's assistant dragging another heavy sack, different from the one Benjamin had observed earlier. This one appeared to be dripping a dark liquid that glistened in the moonlight. Benjamin retreated to his room, mind racing. He wrote in his journal until late into the night, documenting the strange conversation, the peculiar reactions to the stew, and the sheriff's ominous warning. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and plagued with dreams of bubbling pots and faceless travelers vanishing into the vast Texas plains. Chapter 3. Nocturnal Discovery. Benjamin awoke with a start, momentarily disoriented in the unfamiliar room. The inn was eerily quiet, with only the occasional creak of settling timber breaking the silence. His pocket watch showed 3 in the morning. Something had woken him, a noise or perhaps a remnant of his disturbing dreams. He lay still, listening. There it was again, a muffled thump from somewhere below, followed by what sounded like dragging. Curiosity overrode caution as Benjamin slipped out of bed and into his clothes. He'd been a journalist long enough to know that the most revealing moments often occurred when people believed themselves unobserved. Taking care to avoid the squeaking floorboards he'd noted earlier, Benjamin crept down the hallway to the stairs. The main floor was dark except for a faint light seeping from beneath the kitchen door. He descended slowly, one hand against the wall for guidance. A pained groan emanated from beyond the kitchen human, but barely so. Benjamin froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. The sound came again, followed by Wilcox's voice, too low to discern the words but unmistakably threatening in tone. Pressing himself against the wall, Benjamin edged toward the kitchen door, which stood slightly ajar. Through the narrow opening, he could see a portion of the kitchen and an open doorway beyond, leading to what appeared to be a cellar. Wilcox emerged from this doorway, wiping his hands on a cloth that came away dark with what Benjamin instinctively knew was blood. The innkeeper moved to a large butcher block where various tools were arranged with meticulous precision: cleavers, bone saws, skinning knives, and other implements Benjamin couldn't identify. Wilcox selected a large cleaver, testing its edge with his thumb before returning to the cellar. Benjamin's journalistic instinct screamed for him to investigate further, but self-preservation kept him rooted in place. Another groan from the cellar, weaker this time, decided him. He needed to alert the sheriff immediately. As he began to retreat, Benjamin's elbow caught a decorative plate displayed on a small table. It wobbled precariously before he could steady it, but not before it rattled audibly against the wood. The sound, though slight, was enough. The kitchen fell silent. "Who's there?" Wilcox called, his voice deceptively calm. "Young Thomas, is that you?" Benjamin remained motionless, scarcely daring to breathe. "If someone's playing games," Wilcox continued, his footsteps approaching the kitchen door. "I should warn you, I don't appreciate prying eyes." In that moment, Benjamin made a split-second decision that would haunt him for years. Rather than fleeing upstairs, he stepped boldly into the kitchen doorway, affecting a casual demeanor despite the terror clawing at his insides. "My apologies, Mr. Wilcox. I was having trouble sleeping and thought I might find something to settle my stomach." Wilcox stood before him, cleaver still in hand, his shirt sleeves now rolled up and stained with fresh crimson splatters. Behind him, the cellar door stood open, revealing stone steps descending into darkness. "Trouble sleeping," Wilcox repeated, his eyes calculating. "That's unfortunate. Nothing worse than a restless night before travel." "Indeed," Benjamin agreed, desperately maintaining his composure while noting every detail: the unusual hooks hanging from the ceiling, the oversized drainage grate in the floor, the peculiar copper trough leading from the butcher block to a large barrel. "Perhaps some warm milk, if you have it?" Wilcox's gaze remained fixed on Benjamin for an uncomfortably long moment before his face relaxed into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Of course. Can't have our distinguished guest from Boston unable to write his stories due to lack of sleep." He set down the cleaver and moved to a small icebox, retrieving a bottle of milk. As he poured it into a pan on the stove, Benjamin risked a glance toward the cellar. From his new angle, he could see what appeared to be a human hand at the bottom of the steps, the fingers twitching feebly. "Sugar?" Wilcox asked, his back to Benjamin. "No, thank you." Benjamin struggled to keep his voice steady. "Plain is fine." As Wilcox busied himself with the milk, another sound emerged from the cellar, a rattling, gurgling breath that could only be someone's final moments of life. Wilcox appeared not to notice, humming softly as he stirred the warming milk. "You know, Mr. Mercer," he said without turning around, "curiosity is an admirable trait in a journalist. But it can be dangerous in certain situations. Some stories, well, they're best left untold." Benjamin's mouth went dry. "I'm not sure I take your meaning, sir." Wilcox turned, holding the steaming cup of milk. His expression was pleasant, but his eyes held a predatory focus that made Benjamin's skin crawl. "I think you do. It's been asking questions around town. Speaking with Sheriff Callahan about disappearances. Simply gathering local color for my article, of course." Wilcox extended the cup. "Your milk, Mr. Mercer." Benjamin accepted it, careful not to let their fingers touch. "Thank you for your hospitality. It's my pleasure to serve." Wilcox's emphasis on the final word sent a chill down Benjamin's spine. "Oh, I must insist you return to your room now. The kitchen can be hazardous at night. So many sharp implements." Benjamin nodded, backing toward the door with the untouched milk. "Good night, then." "Sleep well, Mr. Mercer," Wilcox called after him. "Tomorrow's stagecoach waits for no one." Back in his room, Benjamin poured the milk out the window, convinced it had been tampered with. His mind raced with the implications of what he'd witnessed. The groaning victim, the butchering tools, the suspicious stew. The conclusion was too horrific to contemplate, yet impossible to dismiss. He sat at the small desk, pulling out his journal and recording everything in frantic, sometimes illegible script. If something happened to him, someone needed to know the truth about Abraham Wilcox and his special stew. Chapter 4. The morning after dawn arrived with a crimson streak across the eastern sky, bleeding into the gray remnants of night. Benjamin hadn't slept since returning to his room, his mind churning with horror and indecision. The stagecoach would depart in 2 hours, his chance to escape Crow's Creek and alert authorities in Clarendon. But could he leave, knowing another traveler might be imprisoned in Wilcox's cellar? He peered out his window at the now familiar view of the smokehouse and barn. In the early morning light, he noticed details previously hidden by darkness: a well-worn path between the structures, dark stains on the ground that rain had never quite washed away, and most disturbing, what appeared to be a human femur partially buried near the smokehouse door. A knock at his door made Benjamin start violently. "Mr. Mercer?" It was Thomas. Wilcox's young assistant, his voice barely above a whisper. "Breakfast will be served soon. Mr. Wilcox sent me to make sure you're awake." "Thank you, Dummas. I'll be down shortly." Benjamin listened to the boy's retreating footsteps, then quickly gathered his belongings. He had no intention of consuming anything else in this establishment. His plan was simple: appear for breakfast, make his excuses about needing fresh air before the journey, and find Sheriff Callahan. When Benjamin entered the dining room, he found it less populated than dinner. Only the elderly woman from the stagecoach and one of the ranchers were present, both looking pale and uncomfortable. Of the cattle buyer and the other passengers there was no sign. "Good morning," Benjamin greeted them, taking a seat nearby. "Ready for the journey ahead?" The woman nodded weakly. "If my stomach settles." "That stew disagreed with me something terrible." "Same here," the rancher muttered. "Never been so sick. Spent half the night visiting the outhouse." Before Benjamin could respond, Wilcox emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of biscuits. His eyes immediately found Benjamin, a peculiar smile spreading across his face. "Mr. Mercer, thought we might have lost you to the Sandman. How did you sleep after our midnight encounter?" "Not well, I'm afraid," Benjamin replied truthfully. "A pity. Well, a hearty breakfast will set you right." Wilcox set down the biscuits and leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Though I must say you look a bit peakish. Perhaps you should consider delaying your departure, resting here another day." The suggestion, delivered with such apparent concern, chilled Benjamin to the core. "That's very kind, but I have pressing deadlines." "Deadlines?" Wilcox straightened, his expression hardening momentarily. "Yes, I suppose we all face those eventually." The innkeeper returned to the kitchen, leaving Benjamin to pick at a biscuit he had no intention of eating. The elderly woman soon excused herself, still looking unwell, while the rancher gulped coffee that smelled strongly of chicory. "Where are the other passengers?" Benjamin asked casually. The rancher shrugged. "The cattle buyer said something about checking livestock at the southern pasture before we leave. Others couldn't say." Benjamin nodded, formulating his next move. He needed to find Callahan, but leaving abruptly might alert Wilcox to his suspicions. The solution presented itself when Thomas entered with fresh coffee. "Thomas," Benjamin said, "might I trouble you for directions to the telegraph office? I should send word to my newspaper about my progress." "Ain't no telegraph in Crow's Creek," the boy replied, eyes downcast. "Nearest one's in Clarendon." "I see. And where might I find Sheriff Callahan this morning?" Thomas glanced nervously toward the kitchen. "Sheriff rides out early most days. Patrols the territory." Benjamin was about to press further when Wilcox's voice boomed from behind him. "The sheriff won't be back until this afternoon," he said, carrying a platter of eggs and ham that made Benjamin's stomach turn. "Is any particular reason you're looking for him, Mr. Mercer?" "Just professional courtesy," Benjamin lied smoothly. "Thought I'd interview him about law enforcement on the frontier." Wilcox's eyes narrowed slightly. "How conscientious of you. Well, I'm afraid you'll miss him today. Stagecoach leaves in an hour." As Wilcox distributed breakfast, Benjamin noticed the rancher had departed, leaving him alone with the innkeeper. The tension in the room was palpable. "You know," Wilcox said conversationally, taking a seat across from Benjamin, "I've been thinking about your newspaper articles. What exactly will you be writing about Crow's Creek?" Benjamin met the man's gaze steadily. "Just observations of frontier hospitality, the unique cuisine of the region." Wilcox's face remained impassive, but his knuckles whitened around his coffee cup. "I do hope you'll send me a copy when it's published. I'd be most interested in how you characterize your experience here." "Of course," Benjamin replied, rising from his seat. "If you'll excuse me, I should prepare for departure." As Benjamin turned to leave, Wilcox called after him, "One moment, Mr. Mercer. I believe you dropped something last night." Benjamin froze as Wilcox reached into his pocket and produced a small leather-bound notebook, Benjamin's journal. "Fascinating reading," Wilcox continued, his voice dangerously soft. "Such a vivid imagination you have, particularly the part about what you think you saw in my cellar." Benjamin's blood ran cold. "That's private property, Mr. Wilcox." "Indeed it is," the innkeeper agreed, tucking the journal back into his pocket. "As is my establishment and my ... recipes. It seems we're at an impasse regarding respect for privacy." The two men stared at each other, the pretense of civility evaporating. In that moment, Benjamin realized he might not leave Crow's Creek alive. Chapter 5. The missing sheriff. The tense standoff between Benjamin and Wilcox was broken by the sound of the stagecoach arriving outside, horses' hooves kicking up dust as it rattled to a stop before the inn. The driver called out, 30 minutes to departure. All passengers gather your belongings." Wilcox's eyes never left Benjamin's face. "Well, Mr. Mercer, it seems your chariot awaits, though I wonder if you might reconsider staying another night." There's so much more of Crow's Creek you Haven experienced. I appreciate the offer, Benjamin replied carefully, but I really must continue my journey. As you wish. Wilcox rose, still holding Benjamin's journal. I'll keep this safe for you. Perhaps you can collect it on your return journey. The implication was clear. Wilcox had no intention of returning the incriminating document. Benjamin considered demanding it back, but the gleam in the innkeeper's eyes suggested such a confrontation might end poorly. Very well. I'll be down shortly to settle my account. Upstairs, Benjamin quickly assessed his situation. The journal contained detailed observations of everything he'd witnessed, including his nocturnal discovery in the kitchen and cellar. Without it, his accusations against Wilcox would be his word against a respected local businessman's. He needed evidence. A plan formed in Benjamin's mind, reckless perhaps, but necessary. He would board the stagecoach as expected, but disembark at the first opportunity and double back to Crow's Creek. He could hide until nightfall, then search for concrete evidence of Wilcox's crimes. As he descended the stairs with his bag, Benjamin saw the elderly woman and one other passenger already waiting by the stagecoach. There was still no sign of the cattle buyer or several others who had dined at the inn the previous night. Leaving us so soon? Wilcox stood by the counter, Benjamin's journal nowhere in sight. I was hoping you might sample tonight's special before departing. I've selected quite particular ingredients for the occasion. The barely veiled threat made Benjamin's skin crawl. Another time, perhaps. After settling his bill, Benjamin stepped outside into the bright Texas sunshine, grateful to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the inn. He loaded his bag onto the stagecoach and was about to climb aboard when he spotted a familiar figure riding into town Sheriff Callahan. Benjamin's heart leaped. Here was his opportunity to report what he'd witnessed without risking a return to Crow's Creek. He started toward the approaching lawman, but stopped short when he saw Wilcox emerge from the inn behind him. "Sheriff," Wilcox called out jovially. "Unusual to see you back so early from patrol." Callahan dismounted, tipping his hat to the innkeeper. "Special circumstances, Abraham. Got word from Clarendon about that situation we discussed." Benjamin watched the interaction carefully, noting the apparent familiarity between the two men. When Callahan's eyes met his, Benjamin detected none of the wariness from their previous conversation, only a bland politeness that seemed peculiarly forced. "Mr. Mercer, isn't it?" the sheriff said. "Heading out with today's coach?" "Yes," Benjamin confirmed, studying the sheriff's face. Something was different about the man, his manner more stilted, his eyes lacking the sharp intelligence Benjamin had noticed the night before. "Although I hope to speak with you first about certain observations I've made during my stay." Callahan glanced at Wilcox, who maintained his affable smile. "Nothing serious, I hope?" "Potentially quite serious, Sheriff. Regarding disappearances you mentioned last night." A flicker of confusion crossed Callahan's features. "Disappearances? Don't recall discussing any such thing, Mr. Mercer." Benjamin felt a chill run down his spine. Either the sheriff was lying or the alternative was too disturbing to contemplate. "You specifically mentioned 8 missing travelers over 2 years, Benjamin insisted. Wilcox laughed, clapping a hand on the sheriff's shoulder. "Our friend from Boston has quite an imagination, doesn't he, Robert? Must be that newspaper training, always looking for sensational stories where none exist." Callahan smiled thinly. "Indeed. No disappearances reported in Crow's Creek during my tenure, Mr. Mercer. Perhaps you dreamed our conversation." Benjamin looked between the two men, realization dawning. The sheriff's different demeanor, his denial of their previous conversation, the peculiar flatness in his eyes. Callahan was either complicit or more likely under some form of coercion. "Perhaps I was mistaken," Benjamin conceded, changing tactics. "In any case, I'd like to file a formal complaint about theft. Mr. Wilcox has taken my personal journal." "That's a serious accusation," Callahan said, turning to Wilcox. The innkeeper spread his hands innocently. "I've taken nothing, Sheriff. Perhaps Mr. Mercer misplaced his journal in his haste to depart. We could search his room again if he wishes." The stage driver interrupted, calling final boarding. Benjamin knew he was out of options, at least for now. "No matter," he said, backing toward the stagecoach. "I can always start a new journal, and I have an excellent memory for details." Wilcox's smile never wavered, but his eyes hardened. "Safe travels, Mr. Mercer. Do be careful on those frontier roads. All manner of dangers await the unwary traveler." As the stagecoach pulled away from Crow's Creek, Benjamin looked back to see Wilcox and Callahan watching him depart, standing side by side like sentinels. His mind raced with questions. What hold did Wilcox have over the sheriff? What had happened to the missing cattle buyer and other travelers? And most disturbing, what exactly had been in that stew they'd all consumed the previous night? Benjamin settled back against the hard seat, mentally revising his plan. He would not return to Crow's Creek alone. That would be suicide. Instead, he would continue to Clarendon and telegraph his editor in Boston, as well as the Texas Rangers. Someone needed to investigate Abraham Wilcox and the horrors taking place at his inn, before more travelers disappeared from the face of the earth. Chapter 6. Roadside revelation. The stagecoach had traveled less than 10 miles from Crow's Creek when disaster struck. A thunderous crack split the air as the rear axle gave way, sending the vehicle lurching violently to one side. Benjamin grabbed the window frame to steady himself as the coach ground to a halt amid the driver's colorful curses. "Everyone out," the driver called, jumping down to inspect the damage. Damn thing's broken clean through. The passengers, Benjamin, the elderly woman, and a silent man who had boarded at the last minute, disembarked into the scorching midday heat. The Texas landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, offering no shade or shelter from the merciless sun. "Can it be repaired?" Benjamin asked, already suspecting the answer. The driver shook his head grimly. "Here. Need a proper wheelwright and new timber?" He squinted back toward Crow's Creek, then at the distant horizon ahead. "Clarendon's still 25 miles out. Crow's Creek is closer. How long will repairs take?" the elderly woman asked, fanning herself with a handkerchief. "Day or two if we're lucky," the driver replied. "I'll need to ride one of the horses back to Crow's Creek. Get help." Benjamin felt a knot form in his stomach. Returning to Wilcox's domain was the last thing he wanted. "Perhaps we could continue to Clarendon on horseback?" "These coach horses ain't saddle broke," the driver said. "And the lady here couldn't make that journey regardless." The elderly woman nodded in agreement, already wilting in the heat. "I'll ride back for help," the driver decided. "You folks wait with the coach. Shade underneath it at least." As the driver unhitched one of the horses and prepared to depart, Benjamin noticed the silent passenger watching him with peculiar intensity. The man was lean and weathered, with eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they observed. He had said nothing since boarding, and even now maintained his silence as the driver mounted and galloped back toward Crow's Creek. Once the dust settled, the elderly woman sought refuge in the meager shade beneath the coach, while Benjamin paced anxiously, weighing his options. Attempting to walk to Clarendon in this heat would be foolhardy at best, fatal at worst. "You're afraid to return to Crow's Creek," the silent passenger suddenly spoke, his voice startling in the quiet landscape. Benjamin turned, studying the man carefully. "Should I be?" "That depends on what you know." The man extended his hand. "Daniel Reed, U.S. Marshal's Office." Benjamin hesitated before shaking the offered hand. "You're a long way from a federal courthouse, Marshal." Reed's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "I go where the evidence leads. Been tracking a series of disappearances along the stage routes through the Texas Panhandle. All with one common factor. Wilcox Inn," Benjamin guessed, his suspicions crystallizing. Reed nodded, his eyes never leaving Benjamin's face. 17 missing persons in 3 years. No bodies, no witnesses. Just people who ate at Wilcox's table and were never seen again. 17? Benjamin's blood ran cold. "Sheriff Callahan mentioned only 8. "Callahan's compromised," Reed replied flatly, "either willingly or otherwise. Been watching him for months." Benjamin glanced at the elderly woman, now dozing in the shade, before lowering his voice. "I saw something last night. Someone in Wilcox's cellar, being butchered." Reed showed no surprise, merely nodded for Benjamin to continue. "I believe Wilcox is killing travelers and ... double." Benjamin could barely bring himself to say it, "and serving them to his guests." "You have proof?" He took my journal containing my observations, but I know what I saw. "And the stew," Benjamin swallowed hard at the memory. "It wasn't venison." The marshal was silent for a long moment. "I've been building a case for months. Gathering evidence, testimonies from people who passed through and noticed peculiarities. But I need eyewitness testimony to get the Rangers involved." "You have mine," Benjamin said firmly. "But I fear returning to Crow's Creek. Wilcox made it clear he considers me a threat. The axle breaking was no accident," Reed stated matter-of-factly. "This coach was sabotaged before it left town." Benjamin's eyes widened. "You mean Wilcox never intended for you to reach Clarendon?" "The driver's in his pocket. He'll return with Wilcox in a wagon, claiming to offer assistance. And you'll never leave Crow's Creek again." The revelation sent a chill through Benjamin, despite the heat. "What do we do?" Reed reached inside his coat and withdrew a Colt revolver, checking its chambers before returning it to his holster. "We don't wait here to be collected. The elderly lady will be safe enough. She's not a threat to Wilcox. But you and I need to find a defensible position where we can observe who comes for this coach. You think Wilcox himself will come?" "Count on it. A man like that doesn't delegate the important killings." Reed squinted at the sun. We have maybe 2 hours before they return. There's a rocky outcropping about half a mile west. Good vantage point, natural cover. We'll wait there. As they prepared to depart, Benjamin explained their plan to the elderly woman, who seemed more annoyed at the delay than concerned about potential dangers. "Just be sure someone comes back for me before sundown," she insisted. "I've no intention of spending the night in this wilderness." Benjamin and Reed set out across the plains, the sun beating down on their backs. The landscape offered little cover, mostly scrub brush and occasional mesquite trees twisted by years of harsh conditions. The outcropping Reed had mentioned was barely visible on the horizon, a dark smudge against the relentless blue sky. "You're a newspaper man?" Reed asked as they walked. "From Boston, yes." "Good. If we survive this, your story could help bring Wilcox to justice. People need to know what happened at Crow's Creek." They reached the outcropping and climbed to a position that offered a clear view of the disabled stagecoach while providing ample cover. Reed produced a small spyglass from his pack and trained it on the eastern horizon. "Now we wait," he said grimly, "and pray we're not already too late." As the afternoon wore on, Benjamin's thoughts returned to the cellar beneath Wilcox's kitchen, and the hand he'd seen twitching at the bottom of the stairs. Had that been the cattle buyer who'd failed to appear for breakfast? Or some other unfortunate traveler whose disappearance would never be investigated? "Movement," Reed announced suddenly, extending the spyglass. "Dust cloud from the east. They're coming." Benjamin squinted against the harsh sunlight. A small wagon was approaching the disabled stagecoach, 2 riders flanking it. Even at this distance, he recognized Wilcox's broad-shouldered silhouette. "The driver's with him," Reed confirmed, his voice tight. "And Callahan, too. Wilcox must be worried to bring the sheriff along." Through the spyglass, Benjamin watched as the 3 men reached the stagecoach. The elderly woman emerged from beneath the vehicle, exchanging words with the newcomers. Wilcox dismounted, scanning the surroundings with obvious agitation. "He's looking for you," Reed observed, "noticing you're not there." They watched as Wilcox gesticulated angrily at the driver, who spread his hands in apparent confusion. The sheriff began circling the area, examining the ground. "Callahan's tracking us," Benjamin whispered. Reed nodded grimly. He was a bounty hunter before becoming sheriff. Man knows how to follow a trail. Sure enough, Callahan soon found their tracks leading away from the coach. He conferred briefly with Wilcox, pointing toward the outcropping where Benjamin and Reed were concealed. "They've spotted our trail," Reed said, checking his revolver again. "We need to move." "Where?" Benjamin asked, panic rising in his throat. "There's nowhere to hide out here. Down the backside of these rocks. There's a small arroyo that might provide cover." Reed was already moving, sliding down the rough stone. "Stay low and follow me." They descended into a dry creek bed that cut through the landscape, offering some protection from searching eyes. Reed led the way, moving with the practiced efficiency of a man accustomed to pursuit. "What's our plan?" Benjamin asked, his city boots struggling with the uneven terrain. "Circle around, get behind them," Reed replied without slowing. "While they're searching the outcropping, we'll make for their wagon. It's our only chance to reach Clarendon alive." They moved as quickly as caution allowed, using the natural contours of the land to shield their progress. After 20 minutes of grueling travel, Reed signaled a halt, pointing to a rise ahead. "The stagecoach should be just beyond that ridge," he whispered. "We'll approach slowly. If they've left someone guarding the wagon, I'll handle it." The grim implication of those words wasn't lost on Benjamin, but he nodded his understanding. They crept forward, stopping just short of the ridge. Reed belly-crawled to the top, peering cautiously over. "Damn," he muttered, sliding back down. "The wagon's there, but the old woman's gone." "They've left Thomas guarding it, the innkeeper's boy?" Benjamin asked, remembering the thin teenager. Reed nodded. "He's holding a shotgun, but looks nervous. Probably never fired it." "We can't hurt the boy," Benjamin insisted. "He's likely another victim of Wilcox's schemes." "I know," Reed agreed. "I'll try talking to him. You stay here until I call for you." Before Benjamin could object, Reed was moving, approaching the ridge openly with his hands raised. Benjamin watched anxiously as the marshal disappeared over the top, straining to hear the exchange that followed. "Easy now, son," Reed's voice carried on the still air. "It's a lot of firepower for a boy your age." Stay back." Thomas's voice was high with fear. "Mr. Wilcox said to shoot anyone who comes near the wagon. Did he now? And did he tell you why?" A pause. "I said there's dangerous men about. He's trying to cause trouble. The only dangerous man out here is Abraham Wilcox," Reed replied evenly. "You know that, don't you, Thomas?" Another, longer pause. "Don't know what you mean." "I think you do. I think you've seen things at that inn. Things no boy should see." Benjamin edged forward, risking a glance over the ridge. Thomas stood by the wagon, shotgun wavering in his trembling hands. Reed stood about 20 paces away, his own weapon holstered, hands still raised. You know what Wilcox does to those travelers? Reed continued, his voice gentle but insistent. You know what goes into that stew? Thomas's face contorted. I never helped with that, just cleaned up after. I believe you, Reed said, and I can help you, Thomas. But you need to put down that shotgun. The boy's internal struggle was evident on his face. Finally, the shotgun barrel lowered. What'll happen to me? You'll testify against Wilcox, tell the authorities what you've witnessed. Then you'll get a fresh start somewhere far from here. As Thomas lowered the weapon completely, Benjamin stood and made his way down the slope to join them. Where are Wilcox and the others now? He asked the boy. Searching the rocks to the west, Thomas replied, eyes downcast. Said they'd be back within the hour. Reed moved swiftly to the wagon, checking the horses. These are fresh. We can make good time to Clarendon if we leave now. What about the elderly woman? Benjamin asked. Thomas's face paled. Mr. Wilcox took her, said she'd slow them down. The implication hung heavily in the air. We can't help her now, Reed said grimly, climbing onto the wagon seat. But we can ensure Wilcox pays for everything he's done. Both of you, get in. As Benjamin helped Thomas into the wagon bed, a rifle shot cracked across the plains. Reed jerked, clutching his shoulders, crimson bloomed across his shirt. Get down, he shouted, diving from the seat as another bullet splintered the wood where he'd been sitting. Benjamin pulled Thomas down into the wagon bed, peering cautiously over the edge. Approximately 300 yards away, Wilcox and Callahan were approaching on horseback, the sheriff working the leva on his Winchester. The stagecoach driver was nowhere to be seen. Can you drive this wagon? Benjamin asked Thomas urgently. The boy nodded, wide-eyed with terror. Then get ready. Marshal Reed and I will provide covering fire. When I give the word, you drive for Clarendon as fast as these horses will run. Don't stop for anything. Benjamin scrambled to where Reed had taken cover behind a wheel, blood seeping between the fingers pressed to his shoulder. How bad? Benjamin asked. Clean through. I'll live. Reed handed Benjamin his Colt. Ever fired one of these? During the war, Benjamin replied, checking the weapon with muscle memory that surprised him. It had been 16 years since he'd seen combat during the Civil War, but some skills never truly faded. Another shot from Callahan's rifle kicked up dirt near their position. The lawmen were closing the distance rapidly. We need to slow them down, Reed said through gritted teeth. Wait until they're within range of that revolver, then aim for the horses. I hate to do it, but we have no choice. Benjamin nodded grimly, positioning himself behind the wagon's tailgate. Wilcox and Callahan had split up, approaching from different angles to divide the defenders' attention. When Callahan was approximately 100 yards out, Benjamin took careful aim and squeezed the trigger. The shot went wide, but caused the sheriff to veer off and seek cover behind a mesquite tree. Wilcox, seeing his advantage, spurred his horse forward, a double-barreled shotgun now visible in his hands. At 70 yards, Benjamin fired again, this time striking Wilcox's horse in the shoulder. The animal stumbled, throwing the innkeeper heavily to the ground. Now! Benjamin shouted to Thomas. Go! The boy scrambled onto the wagon seat, cracking the reins against the horses' backs. The wagon lurched forward as Callahan emerged from cover, rifle raised. Reed, despite his wound, managed to fire 2 shots from Thomas's discarded shotgun, forcing the sheriff back into cover. Meanwhile, Benjamin kept his revolver trained on Wilcox, who was struggling to his feet, shotgun still clutched in one hand. It's over, Wilcox, Benjamin called out. The authorities in Clarendon will know everything by nightfall. The innkeeper's face contorted with rage. You think anyone will believe you? A city journalist making wild accusations about a respected businessman? They'll believe the U.S. Marshal you just shot, Benjamin replied, backing toward the accelerating wagon. And they'll believe the boy who's witnessed your butchery for years. Wilcox's eyes widened as he spotted Thomas driving the wagon. You ungrateful little. He raised his shotgun, aiming not at Benjamin but at the boy's back. Benjamin fired without hesitation, the bullet striking Wilcox in the chest. The innkeeper staggered but remained standing, his shotgun wavering. Benjamin fired again and Wilcox finally collapsed, the unfired weapon falling from his hands. With Callahan still pinned down by Reed's covering fire, Benjamin helped the wounded marshal into the wagon. They thundered away across the plains, leaving behind the disabled stagecoach, the wounded sheriff and the body of Abraham Wilcox, the monstrous proprietor whose secret recipe had claimed at least 17 lives. Chapter 7. Clarendon's disbelief. The wagon rattled into Clarendon shortly after sunset, dust-covered and bearing 3 exhausted passengers. Benjamin had bandaged Reed's shoulder as best he could during the journey, but the marshal needed proper medical attention. Thomas had driven tirelessly, his young face set with grim determination. Their arrival caused an immediate stir in the small frontier town. The wagon, recognized as belonging to the infamous innkeeper of Crow's Creek, drew suspicious glances from locals gathered outside the saloon. When Benjamin helped the wounded marshal down from the vehicle, several men rushed forward to assist. "This man is U.S. Marshal Daniel Reed," Benjamin announced. "He's been shot by Sheriff Callahan of Crow's Creek. We need a doctor immediately." The town's physician was summoned and Reed was carried to his office for treatment. Meanwhile, Benjamin and Thomas were escorted to the office of Clarendon's own sheriff. Jacob Thornton, a square-jawed man with a skeptical gaze that hardened as Benjamin recounted their ordeal. "Let me understand this clearly," Sheriff Thornton said after listening to Benjamin's story. "You're accusing Abraham Wilcox, a man I've known for 7 years, of murdering travelers and—" He paused, seemingly unable to voice the accusation. Serving them to his guests, Benjamin finished firmly. "Yes, Marshal Reed has been investigating the disappearances for months, and Thomas here can confirm everything." All eyes turned to the boy, who sat hunched in a corner chair, looking smaller than his years. Thomas nodded weakly but said nothing. Sheriff Thornton leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowed. "That's a mighty serious accusation, Mr. Mercer. The kind that requires substantial proof." "I saw a victim in his cellar with my own eyes," Benjamin insisted. "And Marshal Reed was shot by Sheriff Callahan while Wilcox attempted to kill us." "Callahan's a decorated lawman," Thornton countered. "Why would he participate in such depravity?" "I don't know his motives," Benjamin admitted, "but his actions were unmistakable. He tracked us from the disabled stagecoach and opened fire without provocation." Thornton studied Benjamin for a long moment. "And you say Wilcox is dead? You shot him? In self-defense?" He was about to fire on Thomas. The sheriff sighed heavily, rising from his desk. "I'll need to telegraph the Texas Rangers about this, and the U.S. Marshal's office to confirm Reed's identity. In the meantime, you and the boy will remain in Clarendon." "Are we under arrest?" Benjamin asked incredulously. "Let's call it protective custody," Thornton replied evenly. "If your story is true, you'll have nothing to worry about. If not, he let the implication hang in the air." Benjamin and Thomas were provided rooms at the Clarendon Hotel, with a deputy posted in the hallway for their protection. The accommodations were comfortable enough, but the sense of being prisoners rather than witnesses grated on Benjamin's nerves. Late that evening, the town doctor visited to inform them that Marshal Reed was stable but weakened from blood loss. "He's asking for you," the doctor told Benjamin. "Says it's urgent," under the deputy's watchful eye. Benjamin was escorted to the doctor's residence, where Reed lay pale against white sheets, his shoulder heavily bandaged. "Mercer," Reed greeted him weakly. "They don't believe us, do they?" Benjamin shook his head. "Sheriff Thornton has telegraphed for confirmation of your identity. Until then, we're essentially detained." Reed grimaced, attempting to sit up before thinking better of it. "My credentials are in my coat pocket, but that won't be enough. We need physical evidence from Wilcox's inn." "Thornton mentioned sending a party to Crow's Creek tomorrow," Benjamin said, "but I doubt they'll find anything. If Callahan survived, he'll have removed any incriminating evidence by now." "There's something else," Reed whispered, motioning Benjamin closer. "Something I didn't tell you before. I believe Wilcox wasn't working alone. There's a pattern of similar disappearances across 3 counties, too widespread for one man." Benjamin felt a chill. "You think there are others like him?" "Maybe not exactly like him, but connected somehow. A network." Reed's eyes burned with feverish intensity. "You need to write your story, Mercer. Get it to your newspaper. If enough people read about what happened at Crow's Creek, others might come forward with similar accounts." "Sheriff Thornton would never allow me to send such a telegram," Benjamin pointed out. "Then find another way," Reed urged. "Your story is the only weapon we have now." Back in his hotel room, Benjamin paced anxiously, wrestling with this new information. If Wilcox had indeed been part of a larger network of killers, then the danger was far from over. And if local authorities refused to believe their account, how many more travelers would disappear before someone took action? A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Benjamin opened the door to find Thomas standing there, the deputy nowhere in sight. "He fell asleep," the boy whispered, slipping into the room. "The deputy been riding patrol all day before he got stuck watching us." Benjamin closed the door quietly. "Good. We need to talk." "About Mr. Wilcox?" Thomas asked, his voice barely audible. "About what he did to those people?" "Yes, and about how we can prove it to Sheriff Thornton." Thomas sank onto the edge of the bed, his thin shoulders slumped. "No one's going to believe us. Mr. Wilcox was friends with all the important folks around here. Even if they did believe something bad happened, they'll just blame it all on me." The resignation in the boy's voice struck Benjamin. "That's not going to happen, Thomas. I won't let it." "You're just passing through," Thomas replied bitterly. "Once you're gone, they'll hang everything on me." Benjamin sat beside the boy, choosing his words carefully. Marshal Reed mentioned that Wilcox might not have been working alone. Did you ever see him with strangers? People who weren't regular travelers? Thomas was silent for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Sometimes men would come at night, not regular guests. They'd meet in the kitchen after everyone was asleep. I wasn't supposed to know, but I heard things. What kind of things? They talked about shipments and merchandise, and they'd exchange things, papers, sometimes money. Once I saw them with a ledger book, had names in it. Places, dates. Benjamin leaned forward, excitement building. Do you know where Wilcox kept this ledger? Thomas nodded. Hidden compartment under the floorboards in his private quarters. That's where he kept valuable things, including your journal, probably. The information was potentially explosive, evidence of a conspiracy extending beyond Crow's Creek. But without access to the inn, they had no way to retrieve it. Thomas, Benjamin said suddenly, is there anyone else who worked at the inn? Anyone who might have seen what Wilcox was doing? The boy thought for a moment. There was a woman, Eliza. She cooked sometimes when there were lots of guests, but she left about a year ago. Said she couldn't stomach the work anymore. His eyes widened with sudden understanding. You think she knew? It's possible, Benjamin replied. Do you know where she went? Heard she went to work for the Henderson family just outside Clarendon. It was a slim lead, but better than nothing. If this Eliza had indeed suspected Wilcox's activities and fled, her testimony could be invaluable. Tomorrow, Benjamin decided, we need to find Eliza, and I need to get a message to my newspaper in Boston. The story has to come out with or without Sheriff Thornton's blessing. Thomas nodded solemnly. I'll help you. I'm tired of being scared all the time. As the boy returned to his own room, carefully avoiding the slumbering deputy, Benjamin began composing his article in his head. Without his journal, he would rely on memory alone to document the horrors of Wilcox Inn. But some memories, he reflected grimly, were impossible to forget, like the sickening realization of what had been served at the innkeeper's table, and the knowledge that he himself had unwittingly consumed human flesh. Sleep eluded Benjamin that night, his mind too filled with the faces of those who had disappeared at Crow's Creek, and the haunting possibility that Wilcox had not been acting alone. By dawn, he had formulated a plan, one that would either expose a network of killers or mark him as a delusional Eastern journalist with an overactive imagination. Chapter 8. The hidden network. Dawn broke over Clarendon with a crimson intensity that reminded Benjamin uncomfortably of blood. He had barely slept, his mind racing with plans and contingencies. Today would determine whether the truth about Abraham Wilcox would be revealed or buried forever. A knock at his door announced the arrival of breakfast stand news. Sheriff Thornton entered behind the hotel porter carrying the tray, his expression unreadable. Telegram came for you, Thornton said, extending a yellow slip of paper. From Boston. Benjamin accepted it cautiously. Scanning the brief message. Received your article. Stop publishing Sunday edition. Stop editor requests. Additional details. Stop. He frowned in confusion. He hadn't sent any article to the Herald. Interesting reading, Thornton continued, watching Benjamin's reaction carefully. Seems your newspaper already knows about your experiences at Crow's Creek. I haven't sent them anything yet, Benjamin replied honestly. Then perhaps you can explain why your editor is publishing a story about Abraham Wilcox serving human flesh to his guests. Thornton's voice hardened. A story that will damage the reputation of this entire region based on nothing but wild accusations. Benjamin's mind raced. Someone had sent an article to the Boston Herald in his name. But who? And to what purpose? Marshal Reed's credentials have been confirmed, Thornton continued. He is indeed a federal marshal. But that doesn't prove your outlandish claims about Wilcox. Sheriff Benjamin set aside the telegram. I understand your skepticism, but there's a witness who might corroborate our story. A woman named Eliza who worked for Wilcox until about a year ago. She's reportedly employed by the Henderson family now. Thornton's eyebrows rose. Eliza Carson? She's a respected member of this community. Are you suggesting she was complicit in these alleged crimes? Not complicit. A witness who left when she suspected what was happening. Benjamin leaned forward earnestly. Sheriff, all I'm asking is that you bring her in for questioning. Let her tell you what she knows about Wilcox's operation. Thornton considered this for a long moment before nodding reluctantly. I'll send a deputy for Mrs. Carson. But I warn you, Mercer, if you're dragging an innocent woman into your delusions, there will be consequences. After the sheriff departed, Benjamin paced his room anxiously. The mysterious telegram troubled him deeply. If someone had impersonated him to the Boston Herald, it suggested a deliberate attempt to discredit his story before he could properly tell it. But who would benefit from such a scheme? And how had they known what he witnessed at Wilcox Inn? Thomas slipped into his room an hour later, his young face taut with worry. Sheriff's men rode out to Crow's Creek at first light, he reported. And they're bringing in Eliza Carson for questioning. Good, Benjamin replied. Her testimony could change everything. Maybe, Thomas said doubtfully, but there's something else you should know. Heard the deputy talking. Sheriff Callahan arrived in town last night with his arm bandaged. He's telling everyone you and Marshal Reed ambushed him and killed Wilcox in cold blood. Benjamin's blood ran cold. Callahan's alive? And here in Clarendon? Thomas nodded. He's at the sheriff's office now. It says you're deranged. Making up stories about Wilcox to sell newspapers back east. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, with Callahan spinning his own version of events, and an unauthorized article potentially about to be published in Boston. Benjamin's credibility was being systematically undermined. We need to speak with Marshal Reed, Benjamin decided, and we need to find a way to send a telegram to my editor explaining the situation. The deputy's watching both entrances to the hotel, Thomas pointed out, and the telegraph office is next to the sheriff's office. Benjamin moved to the window, surveying the street below. The town was coming alive with morning activity, merchants opening shops, cowboys emerging from the saloon where they'd spent the night, a church bell ringing in the distance. There, Benjamin said, pointing to a young boy delivering newspapers. Do you think you could climb down from this window and catch that lad without being seen by the deputy? Thomas's eyes lit with understanding. Yes, sir. Benjamin quickly scrawled a note to Marshal Reed, along with a letter to his editor in Boston, explaining the fraudulent article and outlining the true events at Crow's Creek. He enclosed what little money he had. Give these to the newspaper boy, he instructed Thomas. Tell him there's $5 for delivering the note to Marshal Reed immediately, and another $5 if he takes the letter to the telegraph office and sends it as written. Thomas nodded, tucking the papers into his shirt. With surprising agility for one so thin, he slipped out the window and shimmied down the drainpipe, dropping the last few feet to the ground. Benjamin watched anxiously as the boy casually approached the newspaper delivery boy, made the exchange, and then returned to the hotel through a side door. Done, Thomas reported minutes later, slightly out of breath. He said he'd do it right away. Now they could only wait. Benjamin used the time to prepare Thomas for the questioning that would inevitably come when Eliza Carson arrived. The boy needed to be clear and consistent in his account of what he'd witnessed at Wilcox Inn. Shortly before noon, their hotel room door opened without warning. Sheriff Thornton stood there with two deputies. Mr. Mercer, your presence is required at my office. Mrs. Carson has arrived for questioning. Benjamin and Thomas were escorted through the streets of Clarendon, drawing curious stares from townspeople who had clearly heard rumors about the Eastern journalist and his wild claims. At the sheriff's office, Benjamin was startled to find not only Eliza Carson, a stern-faced woman in her 40s with calculating eyes, but also Sheriff Callahan, his left arm in a sling and his expression thunderous. You, Callahan snarled, rising from his chair. You should be locked up for murder, not parading around town spreading lies about decent folk. Sit down, Robert, Thornton ordered firmly. Everyone will have their say. The room was tense as Thornton conducted the impromptu hearing. Callahan went first, painting a picture of Benjamin and Reed as opportunistic criminals who had attacked him and Wilcox without provocation, killing the innkeeper and stealing his wagon. As for these ridiculous accusations, Callahan concluded, they're nothing but the desperate fabrications of a man trying to create a sensational story for his newspaper. When it was Benjamin's turn, he recounted everything he had witnessed at Wilcox and the strange behavior, the disappearing guests, and most importantly, what he had seen in the cellar. Thomas corroborated his account, describing years of suspicious activities and the mysterious sacks dragged to the smokehouse in the night. Throughout their testimony, Eliza Carson sat impassively, her face betraying nothing. When finally asked to speak, she straightened in her chair and regarded Sheriff Thornton coolly. I worked for Abraham Wilcox for 3 years, she began, her voice steady. I left his employment because I could no longer ignore what was happening there. Callahan shifted uncomfortably as she continued. Mr. Wilcox had special arrangements with certain travelers, those without family connections, those unlikely to be missed. They received particular attention at dinner, stronger drinks than the others, and they never joined breakfast the next morning. The room fell silent as the implications of her words sank in. Did you witness these travelers being harmed? Thornton asked carefully. Not directly, Eliza admitted. Mr. Wilcox was careful about that. But I saw the smokehouse. I saw what went into his stew, and I saw the ledger. Benjamin leaned forward. The ledger? Eliza nodded. He kept records. Names, dates, destinations, and payments. Payments from whom? Thornton pressed. Other establishments along the stage routes. There were at least 6 others involved by my reckoning. They shared information about suitable travelers, divided the belongings, and ... quotes, she hesitated, and shared certain specialty meats among their kitchens. Callahan surged to his feet. This is absurd. You're all conspiring against an honest businessman who can no longer defend himself. Sit down, Robert, Thornton repeated, his tone glacial. Mrs. Carson, are you willing to testify to these facts before a proper court? I am, she replied firmly, and I can tell you where to find the ledger if it hasn't been removed already. There's a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards in Wilcox's private quarters, behind the large oak dresser. Thornton turned to a deputy. Ride to intercept our men at Crow's Creek. Tell them exactly where to look for this ledger. As the deputy departed, the door opened again to admit Marshal Reed, supported by the doctor but standing under his own power. His face was ashen from pain and blood loss, but his eyes were clear and determined. Sheriff Thornton, Reed acknowledged with a nod. I see you're finally getting to the truth of the matter. Marshal, Thornton replied cautiously, you're supposed to be resting. Hard to rest when there's a conspiracy to unravel. Reed's gaze shifted to Callahan, who had gone very still. Sheriff Callahan, I've been investigating disappearances along the stage routes through this territory for 8 months. 17 missing persons, all last seen at establishments like Wilcox Inn. Would you care to explain your relationship with Abraham Wilcox and the others in his network? Callahan's face drained of color. His good hand moved toward his holster, but Thornton was faster, drawing his revolver and leveling it at his fellow lawman. Don't compound your crimes, Robert, Thornton warned. We'll get to the bottom of this with or without your cooperation. For a tense moment, it seemed Callahan might still attempt something desperate. Then his shoulders slumped in defeat. Wilcox had something on everyone, he muttered. Knew things. Made it clear what would happen if I interfered with his business. So you helped him prey on innocent travelers? Benjamin asked incredulously. Callahan wouldn't meet his eyes. I looked the other way, that's all. But Eliza Carson shook her head. Tell them about the arrangements with the stagecoach company, Sheriff. About the drivers who were paid to identify suitable targets and sabotage coaches when necessary. As Callahan's involvement in the grisly enterprise became clear, Sheriff Thornton ordered him placed under arrest. The full extent of the conspiracy was still unknown, but the foundations of Benjamin's account had been vindicated. Eliza Carson's testimony and the potential discovery of Wilcox's ledger promised to expose a network of killers and accomplices stretching across the Texas frontier. By evening, a telegram arrived from the search party at Crow's Creek. The ledger had been found exactly where Eliza described, containing detailed records of Wilcox's horrific enterprise dating back 5 years. More disturbing still, the cellar of the inn had yielded grim evidence confirming Benjamin's worst suspicions: human remains in various stages of processing, and personal effects belonging to dozens of missing travelers. The last entry in Wilcox's ledger, dated the day before Benjamin's arrival at Crow's Creek, contained a chilling notation: Boston journalist arriving tomorrow. Potential complication. Monitor closely. Someone had known Benjamin was coming. Someone had marked him as a threat before he'd even set foot in Crow's Creek. And somewhere in the vast expanse of the Texas frontier, others like Wilcox were still operating, still serving their special recipe to unsuspecting guests. The stage was set for the final confrontation, and the revelation of how deep the conspiracy truly reached. Chapter 9. Justice and Revelations. The Texas Rangers arrived in Clarendon 3 days later. A formidable group of 7 men led by Captain Lawrence Sullivan, whose reputation for relentless pursuit of justice preceded him. Their presence transformed the atmosphere of the frontier town. Saloons quieted, streets cleared, and citizens watched with a mixture of awe and trepidation as the legendary lawmen established temporary headquarters at the courthouse. Benjamin had spent the intervening days recovering from his ordeal and assisting Marshal Reed in organizing the evidence against the Wilcox network. The ledger had proven invaluable, containing not only the names of victims but also collaborators, stage drivers, hotel owners, and even law enforcement officials across 3 counties. Sheriff Callahan, now confined to a cell and facing hanging, had begun cooperating in exchange for considerations at his trial, revealing details of the network's operations that confirmed their worst fears. It's more extensive than we imagined, Reed told Benjamin, as they sat in the marshal's room at the doctor's residence. At least 5 other establishments implicated, all along major stage routes. Isolated places where travelers regularly disappeared without raising alarms. And all serving the same special recipe to their guests, Benjamin added grimly. Reed nodded, his face haunted. Callahan claims it started as a way to rob wealthy travelers with murder to cover the thefts. Other aspect evolved later, partly out of practicality, partly from Wilcox's twisted proclivities. Practicality? Benjamin echoed in disgust. Frontier economics at its most depraved, Reed replied. Nothing wasted, additional profit for meals. and disposal of evidence in the most horrific way imaginable. The Rangers had organized simultaneous raids on all establishments named in Wilcox's ledger, seeking to capture the remaining conspirators before they could destroy evidence or escape. Captain Sullivan had requested Benjamin's presence when he interviewed Thomas and Eliza Carson. Impressed by the journalist's observational skills and determined to include every detail in his official report. "Your newspaper article will be published tomorrow," Sullivan informed Benjamin after one such session. "We've cleared it for publication now that we've secured the primary evidence and suspects. The public has a right to know what transpired here, though I expect many will find it difficult to believe." "I still find it difficult to believe myself," Benjamin admitted, "and I lived through it." That evening, Benjamin was summoned to an unexpected meeting at the courthouse. There he found Captain Sullivan, Marshal Reed, and Sheriff Thornton gathered around a table covered with documents from Wilcox's ledger and correspondence seized from the other establishments. Mercer Sullivan began without preamble. "We've uncovered something troubling that directly concerns you." Benjamin tensed. "Concerning me? How?" Sullivan pushed a letter across the table. "This was found among Wilcox's papers. It's dated 3 weeks before your arrival in Crow's Creek." Benjamin examined the letter. Written in an elegant hand on quality stationery bearing the letterhead of the Boston Chronicle, the Herald's chief rival publication. "Dear Mr. Wilcox, as discussed in our previous correspondence, I am writing to inform you that the Boston Herald is dispatching a journalist named Benjamin Mercer to document frontier life in your region. He is expected to travel the northern route through Crow's Creek in early May. Mercer is known for his investigative tendencies and has previously exposed several scandals in eastern establishments. His presence could pose significant risks to our mutual arrangements if he begins asking questions about missing travelers. I trust you will handle this potential complication with your usual discretion. Remember that our financial arrangement depends on maintaining absolute secrecy regarding our special supply chain. Your partner in enterprise, J.W. Benjamin, looked up, stunned. The Boston Chronicle knew about Wilcox. They were involved in this. Not the newspaper itself, Reed clarified, but someone high in its organization, almost certainly. Someone who benefited financially from Wilcox's operation and used the paper's resources to monitor potential threats. The initials J.W. match several names in the ledger's payment records, Sullivan added, including regular transfers to a James Whitfield, listed as an editor at the Boston Chronicle. Benjamin sat heavily, the implications staggering. "So when I was sent west by the Herald, you were being delivered into a trap," Reed finished. "Your reputation as an investigative journalist made you dangerous to their operation. Wilcox was warned in advance to watch you carefully and eliminate you if necessary, which explains why he took such immediate interest in me," Benjamin realized, "and why he seemed prepared for my questions." Sullivan nodded grimly. "The telegram sent to the Boston Herald in your name was dispatched from Clarendon the morning after your escape from Wilcox. We believe it was sent by another conspirator likely trying to discredit your account before you could publish the legitimate story. Someone in Clarendon," Benjamin murmured, the pieces falling into place. "Someone who knew I was a journalist, knew what I'd witnessed, and had connections to both Wilcox and this James Whitfield in Boston." A heavy silence settled over the room as the four men contemplated the invisible threads of conspiracy stretching from the isolated Texas Inn to the bustling newspaper offices of Boston. "There's something else," Sheriff Thornton said, sliding another document across the table. "This just arrived by telegraph from the Rangers who raided the Sanderson Way station near El Paso. They found this ledger entry." Benjamin examined the page, a chill running down his spine as he read. "April 29, 1881. Received correspondence from J.W. regarding approaching journalist threat. Established contingency with Thatcher at Clarendon Telegraph. Will monitor Herald communications and intercept as necessary. Additional compensation authorized for Wilcox if direct intervention required." "Thatcher," Benjamin repeated. "The telegraph operator here in Clarendon?" Thornton nodded. "Edmund Thatcher. Been running our telegraph office for almost 4 years. Keeps to himself mostly. I never would have suspected ... He's been monitoring communications," Reed concluded, "intercepting telegrams about missing persons, alerting the network to potential investigations, and feeding information back to this J.W. in Boston." Captain Sullivan rose from his chair, his expression hardening. "We need to bring him in now, before he realizes we've connected the dots." The four men moved with purpose through the darkening streets of Clarendon toward the telegraph office, a small building adjacent to the town's post office. Light still glowed from its windows despite the late hour. "Let me go in first," Sullivan instructed, drawing his revolver. "Thornton, cover the back door. Reed, you're still recovering. Stay with Mercer and keep watch from across the street. Benjamin and the wounded marshal positioned themselves in the shadows of a dry goods store as Sullivan approached the telegraph office. The ranger captain entered casually, closing the door behind him. For several long minutes, nothing happened. Something's wrong, Reed muttered. He should have brought Thatcher out by now. The back door of the telegraph office suddenly burst open. A slight man in a telegraph operator's visor cap sprinted into the alley, colliding with Sheriff Thornton, who had been watching the exit. The two men grappled briefly before Thornton subdued the smaller man, forcing him to the ground as Sullivan emerged from the building. Edmund Thatcher, Sullivan announced as Benjamin and Reed joined them. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and aiding in cannibal practices. Thatcher's face twisted with a mixture of fear and defiance. You can't prove anything. I'm just the telegraph operator. We have the ledgers, Benjamin said, stepping forward. We have the correspondence. And we know about your connection to James Whitfield at the Boston Chronicle. At the mention of Whitfield, Thatcher's resistance crumbled. He'll kill me if I talk, he whispered. You don't understand how far his reach extends. Whitfield can't help you now, Sullivan replied, hauling the man to his feet, but cooperation might save you from the gallows. As Thatcher was led away, Benjamin examined the telegraph office with Reed and Sheriff Thornton. The operator's desk contained copies of telegrams sent and received over the past month, including Benjamin's legitimate message to his editor and the fraudulent article supposedly authored by him. He was the perfect accomplice, Reed observed, positioned to monitor all communications in and out of the region. Anything concerning missing travelers, investigations, or suspicions about Wilcox and the others would pass through his hands. And through him to Whitfield in Boston, Benjamin added, who could then warn the entire network. They also discovered a small metal box containing nearly $5,000, an enormous sum that represented Thatcher's payments for his role in the conspiracy. By midnight, Captain Sullivan had extracted a full confession from Thatcher, detailing his 5-year involvement with the Wilcox network and his communications with James Whitfield. The telegraph operator had been recruited shortly after arriving in Clarendon, approached by Wilcox himself with an offer of regular payments for information management. Thatcher claims he never knew about the cannibalistic aspects of their operation, Sullivan reported to Benjamin and Reed. Says he thought it was just robbery and occasional murder of wealthy travelers, not that it absolves him and Whitfield. Benjamin asked. According to Thatcher, Whitfield is the financial backer of the entire enterprise. He provides protection through his newspaper connections, monitors potential investigations from the Eastern End, and receives a percentage of all proceeds. Thatcher's been communicating with him in code for years. We need to apprehend Whitfield immediately, Reed insisted, before he learns of our discoveries here. Sullivan nodded. I've already telegraphed the federal authorities in Boston. They'll move against him tomorrow morning. But given his connections, I'm not optimistic about catching him by surprise. Benjamin's thoughts turned to his editor at the Herald, who had unwittingly sent him into Wilcox's domain. My article will be published tomorrow. Once Whitfield sees it, he'll know his network has been exposed. Let's hope the federal marshals in Boston reach him before he reads your story, Sullivan replied grimly. The following days brought a flurry of activity as the full extent of the Wilcox network was revealed. Simultaneous raids across Texas, New Mexico, and Oklahoma territories had resulted in the arrest of 23 conspirators, including 4 sheriffs, 6 innkeepers, and numerous stage drivers. The physical evidence recovered from their establishments confirmed the group's horrific practices, shocking even the hardened rangers who conducted the investigations. Benjamin's article in the Boston Herald created a sensation, with newspapers across the country reprinting excerpts or entire sections. The story of Abraham Wilcox and his cannibal network became a national discussion, with many readers initially dismissing it as sensationalist fiction until the official reports from the Texas Rangers confirmed every gruesome detail. A week after the arrests, Benjamin received a telegram from his editor. Whitfield escaped federal custody. Stop believed fled country. Stop. Chronicle offices raided evidence seized. Stop your position at Herald secured with rays. Stop return when ready. Stop. The news of Whitfield's escape was disappointing but not surprising. A man with his connections and resources would have contingency plans for discovery. We'll find him eventually, Marshal Reed assured Benjamin as they sat on the porch of Clarendon's hotel, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in shades of orange and purple. Reed's wound was healing well, though he still carried his arm in a sling. Men like Whitfield can't stay hidden forever. Their appetites, financial or otherwise, eventually expose them. I hope you're right, Benjamin replied. But I can't help wondering how many other networks like Wilcox's might exist across the frontier. preying on travelers in isolated locations. Reed's expression darkened. That's why your story is so important, Mercer. It warns people, makes them more cautious, and it puts other predators on notice that they're being watched. Thomas joined them on the porch, looking healthier and less haunted than when they'd first arrived in Clarendon. The boy had been placed in the care of a local family after providing crucial testimony about Wilcox's operations. His knowledge of the inner workings of the inn had helped authorities identify numerous victims through personal effects discovered on the premises. The Rangers are leaving tomorrow, Thomas informed them, settling into a chair. Captain Sullivan says they've gathered all the evidence they need for the trials. And what about you? Benjamin asked. Have you decided what you'll do now? Thomas nodded, a hint of excitement breaking through his usually solemn demeanor. Marshal Reed arranged for me to attend school in Austin. Says I've got potential if I apply myself. Reed smiled. The boy has a sharp mind. Survived years in Wilcox's employ by keeping his wits about him. Deserves a chance at something better. As darkness settled over Clarendon, Benjamin reflected on the strange and horrific journey that had begun with a simple stagecoach stop at Crow's Creek. He had set out to document frontier life for Eastern readers, never imagining he would uncover a conspiracy of murder and cannibalism stretching across hundreds of miles and involving dozens of conspirators. The trials would begin in a month, with Benjamin scheduled to testify against Callahan, Thatcher, and the other captured members of the network. Justice would be served, at least partially. But somewhere, perhaps in Europe or South America, James Whitfield remained free, potentially rebuilding his gruesome enterprise in new territory. You're troubled, Reed observed, noting Benjamin's pensive expression. Whitfield is still out there, Benjamin replied. And we may never know how many innocent travelers were victims of this network before we stop them. True, Reed acknowledged, but think of how many future victims you saved. Your curiosity and courage broke open this case when everyone else was willing to look the other way. Benjamin nodded slowly, taking some comfort in that thought. He had already begun work on a comprehensive book about the case, determined that the full story of Abraham Wilcox and his accomplices would be recorded for history, a cautionary tale about the darkness that could lurk behind the facade of frontier hospitality. As the stars appeared above the Texas plains, Benjamin made a silent promise to the unnamed victims whose remains had been discovered at Wilcox Inn and the other establishments. Their stories would be told, their deaths would not be forgotten, and those responsible would face justice, no matter how long it took or how far they fled. The frontier had revealed its darkest secret, and Benjamin Mercer had survived to tell the tale. Chapter 10. Echoes and Aftermath. Boston, Massachusetts, December 1881. Snow fell gently outside the windows of the Boston Herald's offices. Benjamin Mercer sat at his desk, reviewing the final proofs of his book, The Innkeeper's Recipe, Murder and Cannibalism on the Texas Frontier. After months of investigation, testimony, and writing, the full account of the Wilcox conspiracy was ready for publication. The trials in Texas had concluded 3 weeks earlier, resulting in 15 hangings and 8 long prison sentences for the captured conspirators. Sheriff Callahan, despite his cooperation, had been among those sent to the gallows, his betrayal of his badge and the public trust deemed unforgivable by the jury. Benjamin's testimony had been crucial in securing the convictions. His detailed observations and journalists recall providing a compelling narrative that even the most skilled defense attorneys couldn't undermine. The physical evidence discovered at the various establishments had removed any doubt about the horrific nature of the conspirators' crimes. A knock at his office door interrupted Benjamin's thoughts. His editor, Harold Remington, entered with a telegram in hand and an unusual expression on his face, something between concern and excitement. "This just came for you, Mercer, from Marshal Reed in Austin." Benjamin accepted the telegram, his pulse quickening. He hadn't heard from Reed in several weeks, not since the marshal had traveled to New Orleans following a potential lead on Whitfield's whereabouts. Whitfield spotted aboard vessel to Venezuela. Stop. Federal authorities notified. Stop. Suspect. He has established new operation in South America. Stop. Request your assistance in investigation. Stop. Telegraph if willing to travel. Stop. Read. Benjamin read the message twice, conflicting emotions surging through him. The thought of pursuing Whitfield to Venezuela was daunting, yet he couldn't deny the pull of unfinished business. The architect of the Wilcox network remained free, potentially establishing a new chain of death in South American territories. Bad news? Remington asked, noting Benjamin's expression. Whitfield has been spotted in Venezuela. Benjamin handed the telegram to his editor. Reed wants me to join the investigation. Remington whistled softly as he read the message. Venezuela's a long way from Boston, Mercer, and your book is about to be published, I know. The timing is complicated, on the other hand. Remington continued thoughtfully. A sequel about tracking Whitfield to South America could be even more sensational than the original story. The public's fascination with the Wilcox case hasn't diminished. Indeed, Benjamin's initial articles about the case had catapulted him to national prominence. He was now among the most recognized journalists in America, his name synonymous with the gruesome discoveries in Texas. Lectures he'd given about the case in New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago had drawn standing room-only crowds. It's not about selling books or articles, Benjamin insisted, though he knew Remington wouldn't fully understand. It's about finishing what we started. Whitfield was the mastermind behind it all. Without him, none of it would have happened. Remington studied him for a moment. You feel responsible for the ones he might hurt now? Benjamin nodded slowly. I do. Every time I think about someone else sitting down to a meal at an isolated inn, not knowing what's being served, I can't forget what I ate at Wilcox's table. Harold. What we all ate. The editor grimaced at the reminder. The most horrific aspect of the case, the unwitting cannibalism forced upon guests, had haunted Benjamin since his escape from Crow's Creek. Nightmares about Wilcox's stew still woke him several nights each week, leaving him shaking and nauseous in the darkness. When would you leave? Remington asked, seeming to sense Benjamin's decision before he voiced it. After the book is published. I owe the victims and their families that much, to make sure their story is told completely before I pursue. Whitfield, the Herald, will support your investigation, Remington assured him. Your dispatches from Venezuela would be exclusive to us, of course. As his editor departed, Benjamin turned to the window, watching the snow accumulate on the sills. The peaceful Boston winter scene contrasted sharply with his memories of the Texas frontier, the dusty roads, the isolated inn, the horrors concealed behind Wilcox's cordial smile. A letter had arrived the previous week from Thomas, now settled into his new life at the school in Austin. The boy's handwriting had improved remarkably in the months since their ordeal, and his descriptions of his studies revealed an intelligent mind blossoming with proper education. Marshall Reed had kept his promise to give Thomas a fresh start. Far removed from the shadows of Crow's Creek, Benjamin wondered briefly what had happened to the inn itself. According to his last communication with Sheriff Thornton, the building had been burned to the ground after the investigation concluded, partly to eliminate a gruesome landmark that had begun attracting ghoulish tourists, but also because no one would consider staying there given its history. The land had been sold to a cattle company for grazing, ensuring nothing would ever be built on the site again. Another knock interrupted Benjamin's reflections. A junior reporter entered holding a small package. This was delivered for you, Mr. Mercer. Messenger said it was urgent. Benjamin accepted the package, a small box wrapped in brown paper with no return address. Something about its weight and dimensions made him immediately uneasy. He dismissed the young reporter and carefully unwrapped the parcel, his journalist's caution heightened by years of investigating dangerous stories. Inside the box lay a familiar object that made his blood run cold, his leather-bound journal, the one Wilcox had confiscated at Crow's Creek. The pages were intact, containing all his observations and suspicions about the innkeeper's activities. A folded note accompanied the journal, written in elegant script on high-quality stationery. Mr. Mercer, I return your property as a professional courtesy from one man of letters to another. Your persistence is admirable, if inconvenient. Your friend the Marshal is correct about my whereabouts, though I will be departing for more hospitable climes by the time you receive this. Our mutual business has suffered a setback, but enterprise continues. There will always be isolated travelers seeking shelter and always those willing to accommodate them for a price. Should you choose to pursue me beyond your shores, I caution you that the authorities in certain countries are more amenable to financial persuasion than your Texas Rangers. Your reputation may not protect you as effectively abroad. Consider this friendly advice from an admirer of your work. Your articles were most illuminating, though somewhat sensationalized for my taste. Until our paths cross again, J.W. Benjamin stared at the signature, a chill running through him despite the warm office. Whitfield had been in Boston recently enough to have read about Reed's pursuit and to arrange this delivery. The man's audacity was astonishing, as was his apparent confidence that he remained beyond the reach of justice. Taking a deep breath, Benjamin made his decision. He would telegraph Reed immediately, confirming his willingness to travel to Venezuela after his book was published. Whitfield's note wasn't just a taunt. It was confirmation that the network was being reconstituted somewhere beyond American jurisdiction. More innocent travelers would die if Whitfield wasn't stopped. As Benjamin drafted his response to Reed, he reflected on how thoroughly his life had changed since that fateful stay at Wilcox Inn. He had traveled to Texas, seeking frontier stories for Eastern readers. Instead, he had uncovered a conspiracy of murder and cannibalism that spanned the American West and reached into the highest echelons of Boston society. The innocent journalist who had stepped off that stagecoach in Crow's Creek no longer existed, replaced by a man intimately familiar with humanity's capacity for evil. The case of Abraham Wilcox and his special recipe had transformed Benjamin from observer to participant, from chronicler to crusader. As he prepared to pursue James Whitfield to Venezuela, he understood that the story that had begun in the Texas dust was far from finished. The final chapter would be written far from American shores, in a confrontation between a journalist determined to expose the truth and a murderer equally determined to keep his enterprise and his appetites intact. Benjamin sealed his telegram to read with a steady hand, his resolve hardening. Wilcox had been stopped. His accomplices had faced justice. Only Whitfield remained, the architect of it all, still free to create new networks, claim new victims. That could not stand. The snow continued to fall outside as Benjamin Mercer prepared for one final journey in pursuit of a monster who seasoned his meals with human remains. The innkeeper was dead, but his recipe lived on. And somewhere in South America, travelers were still disappearing, their belongings divided among conspirators. Their flesh served to unwitting guests at remote establishments where the rules of civilization held no sway. The Crimson Proprietor's legacy continued, but so did Benjamin Mercer's determination to end it once and for all.